Ladies and gentlemen, rule Britannia! Rule Britannia!
So in the context of Westminster beginning at least to heal itself, and there are lots of bumps on the road, I'm sure, and the main parties being clustered around quite a constrained middle ground political debate, you might think it's pretty dreary. You might think this is Britain on the way down. I would put to you that if we lose this post-imperial and rather traumatic illusion of being one of the world's great powers and wanting to be considered almost alongside the United States or someone else, if we get rid of that and we say, no, what we want to do is we want to be an ordinary, well-run country, then I think there is a lot of upside in that, a lot of sunlight in that. The days when we used to look down on the Irish or the Danes or the Dutch are gone. Do we envy them these days? Yes, we do envy them a bit these days. To get back to being a relatively well-run social democratic polity without huge international pretensions, I think would be very good for us and would make us, generally speaking, a happier country.
These three big things. One is that partition. At partition, the North was twice as rich as the South. It's now twice as poor. Okay? Number one. The North had dynamic, outward-looking companies that traded all over the world. It now has very few. Okay? The South has managed to bring capital in, and that capital is fused and driven together an economy that is, I would say, one of the more interesting economic test cases that we've seen in many years. If you look at the country, if you look at our history, if you look at the economic opportunities, what you have is a laboratory, Martina, right? So Irish people in one jurisdiction do really badly, Irish people in the other jurisdiction do really well. What's the problem? The jurisdiction, not the people. Right? Think about it. Like, this is so obvious to me. It's so self-evident to me. Like, if economists could have run an economic experiment, partition would have been it. Okay? And they would have said, now, here's the same people. One crowd were rich, one crowd were poor. More or less the same people. Okay? Right? Differences of culture and religion, but in effect, more or less the same people. And what we're going to do is we're going to divide a little line, and we're going to have one jurisdiction and one way of doing things up here, and one way of doing things down here. And let's see what happens. So for the first 25 years, it's like, oh, okay, more or less accords to the way we thought. The Northeast is still better off. The Southwest, kind of disastrous. But then over decades and decades and decades, you see this is like an experiment. And we end up 100 years after partition with the evidence. And the evidence is overwhelming that the people in the northeast of the country under one jurisdiction have done profoundly worse economically than the people in the other jurisdiction. And you draw your conclusions. And the conclusions have to be that it's something to do with the jurisdiction, not with the people. You can't blame the people for this. It's got something to do with jurisdiction.
Where do we end up? We end up with an FDI, foreign direct investment giant. We're the second largest in the world in terms of getting a foreign direct investment. And people say, oh, that's because you're a tax haven, whatever. It's really not. The taxes are what opens the door for these companies. What really sells them on it is it's a very business friendly environment. You can set up a business here in 2 days. There are loads of bilateral tax treaties and loads of connections here, there, and everywhere. 65% of people under 40 have an undergraduate degree. Most of us speak 2 languages. We're extremely well geographically located, like Scotland would be too, by the way. Because if you want to have a transatlantic trade, it's really helpful to be where we are. And fundamentally, the architecture of the state is designed to support this small open economy model. And the structures of the state have bent to accommodate that, right? And the national experiment I was talking about was we have the North, which did not do that, right? So we literally, it's a bit like North Korea and South Korea. Same, that have you seen that famous picture with the lights? I'm not comparing the north of Ireland to North Korea. I'm just be clear. But it's that idea of you've got 2 geographical areas with 2 different rule sets, and we would be about 25% richer per capita than they are. And that's not using a GDP measure. Having all these giant companies here is great for employment, but it also means it distorts our national income statistics. And the brass tacks, if you just look at household disposable income after taxes, the average household in the Republic, the median household, is much wealthier.
Economically, partition has been a total disaster for everyone in the northeast of the country. Everyone, nationalists, unionists, whatever tribe you decide that to hang your colours on. It's been an economic disaster. So had you placed a bet 100 years ago on the day of partition, your bet would have said the following: the northern economy would continue to be a small microcosm of modernity. The southern economy would languish as almost, as you said, an agricultural economy, but an economy that bled its people because of a lack of capital. And those people would have to emigrate. And that was the story from the famine on. And in fact, that was the story up until the 1970s. The southern economy was backward, okay? But the interesting thing, the southern economy turned around. Think about the north, right? The north now is an economic backwater in comparison to the south, okay, on every single metric, not just on income, not just in innovation, not just in startups, not just every single metric, okay? And the reason, I believe, is partition. And because partition robbed the north of its normal hinterland, first of all, number one. And number two, it created a dependency culture, which is very, very evident in the way in which Northern Ireland runs its economy. The Northern Irish economy has, like the rest of the British economy, absent London, the British economy is very backward. And I mean that you can gauge that in a variety of ways in terms of trade, what it makes, what it doesn't make, etc.
The other thing, what I've looked at, if you look at Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, what you see, and I put the north of England and large swathes of the middle of England in this, what you basically see is the progressive emasculation of the innovative power of these regions, because nobody's had to do it. They haven't even had to figure out, what sort of tax regime do we have? How do we get investment in?
Totally.
How do we? But once you actually put that constraint in front of people, it can actually be very energizing, because you can do stuff yourselves.
So Northern Ireland suffered profoundly by not having its own autonomy. That's the key. So what actually happens in economics is, if you have a bond market, Martina, if you have to go out and raise money on your own, with your own flag, with your own risk premium as a country, you mature very quickly, okay? Because you have to get your house in order.
Skin in the game.
Precisely. So if you don't have that, if you're a dependent, if you're like a concubine economy, okay, right? You don't need to actually get up in the morning and say, what are we going to do today, right? So consequently, politics and economics in the north has been diminished to simply a game of who can extract more money out of the exchequer, right? Now, what that does is over 2 or 3 generations, in the first generation or two, that's fine, because it's an easy life. But what actually happens is the rest of the world is moving on, Martina. Nobody's waiting for Northern Ireland to wake up. The Republic of Ireland, because we had our backs against the wall, because we had no capital, because nobody would lend money to us, we had to think, okay, what are we going to do? How do we leapfrog this backwardness into the future? And all small countries have to figure this out. How do you play off the big countries? How do you be a part of the European Union, be attractive to Americans, and be cognizant of the fact that Britain is a significant trade partner? But I'll give you a statistic that shows a diversion of trade. When Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of England, Britain, for the second time in the late 1940s, I think early 1950s. Early 1950s, he got a second.
He stepped down about 51, didn't
He got a second bite of the cherry, I think, right? Yeah. Irish trade to the Irish exports to Britain were 92% of our exports. 93% of our exports went to the UK. Today, it's 11%. So just think about the change in the economy. The Irish economy was hyper dependent on Britain in the 50s. In the Brexiteer epoch that they keep going back to, right? And they still think of the 1950s, right? Okay, as some sort of great beer and warm beer and crickety, all that carry on, right? All that malarkey, and it's only malarkey, right?
Yeah, I mean, so you got to remember, right? So Scotland is starting from a totally different place, a much better place, a place of vastly higher education, great technological advantages, huge goodwill around the world, really coherent set. Also, there's a huge natural resource difference, right? When I think about it, Scottish independence, I genuinely don't think about it in terms of the economics, because after 20 or 30 years, the economics are going to kind of solve themselves. That's my big sort of lesson to you, is that don't view it on a narrow cost benefit analysis of 5 to 10 years. And essentially you're saying that national identity and some kind of geographical coherence probably matters more, and economic structures are going to take care of themselves. That's a reasonable argument to me, given that all of the priors that made Ireland so extremely successful, small open economy, geographically centered in Europe, highly educated population, access to the European Union, all that is true for Scotland. It's also true for here. So it strikes me that the conditions for success are really, really well done. And I just wouldn't get hung up on stuff like, who's going to pay the pensions and all that kind of stuff. It'll be fine.
If you look at small economies, New Zealand, Singapore, Ireland, Israel, Finland, Denmark, all these countries, right? They've all achieved extraordinary things off a pretty flimsy base. And what they have achieved is they've managed to liberate the creative impulses of their own people. And I go back to that idea that I started with, that half of the Irish story is about what we felt like ourselves and how we moved to become a much more open society, and how that openness created the catalyst for people backing themselves, for people deciding to set up their own little companies, to do their thing. All of that is there. That's there for the taking. I mean, that's what's possible. Or you can just go through this decline that you're going through at the moment. That's the choice. The Scottish decline vis-a-vis Ireland is so obvious economically, you shouldn't even have to go over that again. And it's so unusual because it never had to happen, but it has happened. So I think you just say, we could be this, warts and all, because we've loads of things to fix still, or we could just continue to be a concubine of London. First of all, there's nothing to be afraid of with respect to independence. In fact, from what I can see, it's almost all upside. What you do is, because as I said to you, it's how a nation grows up. It's how you walk tall in the world. It's like you're independent. You are a sovereign nation that deals with its own problems, figures out things. If things go wrong, it's your fault. If things go right, it's probably, you can pat yourself on the back, and you create a vision for your country, and that vision you can actually put together the structures to achieve that. So the first thing is that independent countries work. Okay, that's the first thing, right? And they work extremely well. And Scotland is reasonably homogenous. It's amazingly well situated for renewable energy, for all sorts of areas. Then you can take, the Irish approach, maybe attracting foreign capital, all that sort of stuff. I think just go for it. But I mean, the independence, to come back to independence, a country can't grow up unless it's independent. That's the key, right? Like, there's nothing that focuses your mind more than a budget constraint. And there's nothing that tells you how you're doing more than a bond market, right? So if you've got to get up every morning and you want to build something, you've got to go out and borrow it. And you've got to say to people, listen, give us a few quid. What rate of interest do you think we're going to charge you? It's when I look at the regions of the United Kingdom, the countries in the United Kingdom, I just think they've been completely emasculated by London. I mean, it's been an extraordinary. It's extraordinary for me to look at Scotland, which was attracting, and we talked about the Irish diaspora in Scotland. The reason Irish people are in Scotland was because it was a good bloody place to go, right? It was a place that had industry. It was a place that, and what I see is, and again, having worked in the City of London and going up to the Scottish financial centres of Edinburgh and talking to the Scottish widows type people, kind of po-faced Eastern Scots, you know, not that I disliked them, but there was a certain, but they were the last vestiges of the Scottish finance industry in the late 90s, right? It's still there, but it's not as important. But what I could never understand about Scotland was how the country wasn't like Ireland. It didn't feel dynamic. It didn't feel effervescent. It felt, you know, pretty rich by European standards, pretty well off, but, you know, the renaissance, the cultural renaissance that I kind of expected to feel, I didn't. And I think that comes down to not being independent. I really do. Like, the thing about independence, it's like being a child. You know, you make lots of mistakes. Sometimes you grow quickly. Sometimes you grow stunted. Sometimes you do stupid things. But you're a sovereign creature.
9 out of 10 Irish exports went to Britain. Now 1 out of 10 Irish exports go to Britain. Okay? So our economy has changed dramatically. So in a way, and this goes back to Northern Ireland, Britain has remained static. It hasn't dealt with the world as an economic entity. So what we've seen in our lifetime, Martina, is a shift in terms of lifestyle and living standards and whatever, right? And so my sense is that the opportunity for Northern Ireland in the context of a united island economy, okay, are enormous. If you think about income per head, for example, at the moment, the income per head in Northern Ireland is about 24,000 euros per year. Mm-hmm. And in the Republic, it's 40,000 euros a year. And that's not on GDP, that's something called GNI, which strips out all these distortions. So,
okay, but David, just before you move on from that, it's not just income, it's about disposable income. So are there supports perhaps in the north?
If you look at, for example, unemployment benefit in the north, right, vis-a-vis the south, the dole in the south is 185 euros a week. In the north, it's about 58 pounds. I mean, it's, you know, to be poor in the north is a disaster in comparison to the south, okay? The southern welfare state is much more generous, much more generous, and has been for a long time. So this idea that, in fact, there's a nasty, red and tooth and claw capitalist country in the south that doesn't look after its people, just try being unemployed in either jurisdictions, okay? And the reason is because the welfare state of a country has to reflect the income of the country. And if you can generate decent incomes and generate decent wealth, and you and I live down here, Martina, so we know what's going on. This is not a Panglossian world. But what you do understand is that on most metrics, living in the Republic of Ireland provides you with better opportunity.
And the celebration start from Dan Parks. He knew as soon as he had struck it. The clock hit 79 minutes.
Possible. Or you can just go through this decline that you're going through at the moment.